A mother disappears inside her own home, leaving no trace, no message, and no visible struggle behind. This is not simply a missing person case, but an unresolved mystery that has lingered for more than 2 decades. What happened to Patricia Viola in 2001, and why does everything about her disappearance feel so unnervingly quiet? If you are drawn to real unsolved cases, remember to like, share, and subscribe to Criminal Mindcast for more stories. There is something uniquely disturbing about a disappearance that happens without noise. No broken glass, no forced entry, no cries of help. Just absence. Patricia Viola did not vanish from a dark alley or an unfamiliar place. She disappeared from the one location people instinctively trust the most: her own home. That quiet detail, more than anything else, is what continues to haunt investigators and those who study cases like this. To understand the weight of that silence, you have to imagine the setting. Boat Hills in Cohoes, New York, is not a place people associate with danger. It is the kind of neighborhood where routines become invisible through repetition. Cars leave driveways at the same time every morning. Lights turn off at predictable hours. Life unfolds gently, without disruption, without urgency, without fear. Neighbors in this community were not strangers to each other. They recognized faces, exchanged small talk, and shared an unspoken agreement that nothing truly bad would happen here. It was not a place defined by suspicion. It was defined by familiarity. And familiarity, while comforting, often becomes a blindfold. It teaches people to overlook what does not immediately seem out of place, even when something is quietly wrong. The Viola family lived within this calm environment, occupying a house that did not stand out in any particular way. There was no visible chaos, no loud conflicts spilling into the street, no signs that would draw attention. From the outside, everything aligned with the expectations of an ordinary suburban life, and that is precisely what makes the story more unsettling. Because when everything appears normal, there is rarely a reason to look closer. There is no instinct to question what happens behind closed doors. No urgency to notice subtle changes in behavior or mood. The environment itself encourages stillness, predictability, and trust. It creates a space where disruption feels unlikely, even impossible, until it suddenly is not. At the center of this quiet life was Patricia Viola, a 42-year-old mother whose world revolved largely around her family. She was not known for seeking attention or maintaining a wide social circle. Those who knew her described her as reserved, someone who preferred the familiar rhythms of home over the unpredictability of the outside world. Her daily life followed a pattern that to an outsider might seem uneventful, but to her carried meaning and responsibility. She cared for her children, maintained the household, and existed within a structure that gave her a sense of purpose. There were no indications that she wanted to escape that life. No visible signs of restlessness or desire to disappear. In cases where individuals leave voluntarily, there are often small clues that surface in hindsight. A shift in tone, a change in habits, a quiet withdrawal from responsibilities. But in Patricia's case, those indicators were either absent or too subtle to be recognized. Her life, at least on the surface, appeared consistent, predictable, grounded. That sense of predictability matters because it establishes a stable baseline. When someone like Patricia disappears without disrupting that pattern, it challenges the idea of a voluntary departure. Instead, it pushes investigators to consider a different narrative, one defined not by escape, but by interruption. Within that home, Patricia lived with her husband, Michael Viola, and their children, where underlying complexities may have quietly existed. Subtle tension can exist without ever becoming visible to outsiders. It often appears in controlled interactions, in what remains unsaid rather than expressed. Within the quiet structure of daily life, emotions are managed, contained, and sometimes suppressed. These patterns rarely leave physical traces, yet they shape behavior in ways that can quietly alter outcomes. There are indications that the relationship may have included elements of distance or control, though nothing that immediately raised concern. This is how such dynamics often function. They do not reveal themselves abruptly. Instead, they settle into routine, becoming part of the emotional background, something normalized rather than questioned within the flow of everyday life. Neighbors described the Viola family as private, not overtly secretive, but not open either. They existed within the community without deep engagement. This distance can act as both protection and concealment. It reduces outside attention, allowing internal tensions or unresolved conflicts to continue quietly, without interruption or meaningful scrutiny from those beyond the home. The broader environment reinforced a quiet sense of isolation masked as normalcy. There were no reports of break-ins, no known threats, and no history of violent crime nearby to suggest external danger. Everything seemed to point inward rather than outward, even though nothing explicitly confirmed that unsettling direction to investigators at the time. When investigators later examined the circumstances, the absence of external threat became a defining feature. It narrowed the field of possibilities while simultaneously deepening the mystery. If nothing came from outside, then whatever happened likely originated within a space meant to be safe, controlled, and fully understood by those inside it. Understanding a space, however, does not mean understanding the people within it. Homes are rarely as transparent as they appear. They are layered with private thoughts, unspoken tensions, and emotional histories that leave no visible trace. Silence within these spaces can conceal far more than noise ever could reveal to an outside observer. In the days before Patricia disappeared, nothing signaled change. There were no urgent calls, no broken routines, no visible distress. Life moved forward quietly until it did not. Her disappearance emerged not from chaos, but from stillness, leaving no disruption to examine, only absence that deepened the mystery beyond immediate comprehension. November 7, 2001 began like any other day in Boat Hills, with no visible sign that anything unusual was about to unfold. There were no warnings, no disruptions in routine, and no indication that this ordinary morning would later be examined with such intensity. It would only become significant in hindsight when every small detail was forced into a narrative that still refuses to fully form. On that morning, Patricia Viola was believed to be inside her home, moving through the quiet rhythm of her daily responsibilities. There was no urgency, no scheduled departure, and no known plan that required her to leave. The structure of her life suggested continuity, not interruption. Everything pointed toward another uneventful day within the familiar boundaries of her environment. The last confirmed person to have seen Patricia was her husband, Michael Viola. His account became a critical reference point, not because it provided clear answers, but because it was one of the few fixed elements in an otherwise uncertain timeline. In cases like this, the final known interaction often carries disproportionate weight. That final moment is examined repeatedly, not for what it reveals, but for what it might conceal. Every detail is reconsidered, every word measured against time and memory. What appears simple on the surface can hold layers of meaning, because in the absence of evidence, the smallest interaction can become the center of interpretation. There were no recorded phone calls from Patricia that morning, no messages sent, no digital traces that might indicate a shift in her state of mind. In modern cases, technology often leaves behind a trail, but in 2001 that absence was less unusual, yet still significant. It created a void where intention might otherwise be detected. Equally important was what Patricia did not do. She did not pack belongings, withdraw money, or take items that would suggest preparation for departure. There was no evidence of planning, no indication of a transition. The structure of her environment remained intact, untouched by any visible sign of disruption or intentional exit. If she left the house, no one saw her go. There were no witnesses who reported seeing her outside, no neighbors who recalled an unusual interaction, no passing observations that could anchor her movement in time. It was as if the moment of transition from presence to absence occurred without any observable passage. Inside the home, there were no immediate signs of struggle reported. Nothing appeared overturned, nothing visibly disturbed. The physical space did not reflect conflict. Instead, it retained the same quiet order that had defined it before. This lack of disruption would later complicate every attempt to reconstruct what might have occurred. The absence of evidence is often interpreted as evidence of absence, But in investigative psychology, it can also suggest something more deliberate. A controlled environment, one where nothing appears out of place, can sometimes indicate that whatever occurred was contained, managed, or simply went unnoticed within the flow of routine behavior. At some point, the realization emerged that Patricia was no longer in the house. The exact moment of that realization is difficult to define, which in itself becomes part of the problem. Awareness did not arrive immediately. It developed gradually, as the expectation of her presence failed to align with reality. What followed was not an immediate alarm, but a delay. Time passed before Patricia was officially reported missing. That delay would later become one of the most discussed aspects of the case. In missing person investigations, time is not neutral. It either preserves evidence or allows it to fade. The fee. Decision not to report immediately can be interpreted in multiple ways. It may reflect uncertainty, a belief that the person will return, or a reluctance to escalate a situation prematurely. But it can also raise questions about perception, about how the absence was understood in those initial hours. When the report was eventually made, investigators were already working against a shifting timeline. The clarity of the first hours had been lost, replaced by recollection and interpretation. Memory, especially under stress, is not precise. It reconstructs rather than records, and that distinction matters. Michael Viola's role in the timeline drew attention not because of direct evidence, but because of proximity. Being the last person to see Patricia placed him in a position that required scrutiny. His account became a focal point, examined for consistency, for nuance, for any deviation that might suggest something concealed. Some reports suggest that elements of his statements were not entirely consistent over time. These inconsistencies were not necessarily definitive, but they introduced uncertainty. In investigative psychology, inconsistency does not automatically indicate deception, but it does create space for doubt, and doubt invites deeper examination. Despite that scrutiny, there was no concrete evidence linking Michael to a crime, no physical trace, no forensic confirmation, no witness testimony that could establish a clear sequence of events. The case remained suspended between suspicion and proof, unable to move decisively in either direction. As investigators examined the physical environment, they found no signs of forced entry. Doors and windows did not indicate intrusion. There was no immediate evidence that an unknown individual had entered the home. This absence narrowed the range of possibilities, but it also intensified the focus on those already inside. Without signs of entry, without signs of struggle, and without signs of departure, the situation becomes psychologically complex. It does not align with familiar patterns of disappearance. Instead, it challenges the assumptions that typically guide investigations, forcing analysts to consider possibilities that are less visible, less direct, and far more difficult to interpret. Within conventional frameworks, such absence of indicators shifts the focus from what is seen to what is missing. Investigators are left examining silence rather than action, reconstructing events without a clear starting point. This lack of physical disruption suggests either a controlled environment or a sequence of events that unfolded without leaving obvious traces behind. There was no body recovered, no weapon identified, and no physical evidence that could anchor the event to a concrete act. Patricia Viola appeared to dissolve from the structure of her life, leaving behind none of the markers typically associated with disappearance, creating a narrative that lacked a central point of clarity. Perhaps the most unsettling element is the completeness of that absence. It was not partial or fragmented, but absolute. Within the span of a single morning, Patricia seemed to vanish not only from her home, but from the continuity of her own existence, leaving behind only silence and questions that continue to resist resolution. But what investigators would soon discover would only deepen the mystery. When investigators first entered the Viola home, they were not stepping into chaos, but into stillness. The environment did not resist examination. There were no obvious signs of violence, no broken structures, no visible disruption that demanded immediate interpretation. Instead, there was order. And in criminal investigation, order can be more difficult to interpret than disorder. The absence of physical evidence shaped the direction of the case from the very beginning. Without clear indicators of force or struggle, investigators were left to reconstruct events through inference rather than confirmation. This shifts the investigation from what is known to what is possible, and that transition often introduces ambiguity that cannot easily be resolved. Every room was examined for trace evidence, for anything that might suggest movement, conflict, or concealment. Yet nothing emerged that could anchor a definitive narrative. Surfaces remained undisturbed. Objects were where they should be. The home did not behave like a crime scene. It behaved like a place where something had simply stopped. Interviews became the primary tool. Michael Viola, along with other family members, was questioned to establish a coherent timeline. These conversations were not just about facts, but about perception, about how each person understood the events of that day. Inconsistencies, even minor ones, were noted, not as conclusions, but as openings for further examination. However, without corroborating physical evidence, those inconsistencies could not evolve into accusations. They remained suspended, suggestive, but not definitive. This is one of the most challenging aspects of investigative work. Suspicion can exist without proof, and when it does, it creates a tension that persists without resolution. There is also the possibility that early investigative opportunities were limited by timing. The delay in reporting Patricia missing may have allowed subtle forms of evidence to degrade or disappear. In many cases, the first hours are critical, not because they reveal everything, but because they preserve the conditions under which something can be understood. As the investigation extended beyond the immediate environment, attention turned outward toward the community and potential external factors. Yet nothing in the surrounding area indicated a breach. No witnesses came forward with relevant observations, no reports suggested an unfamiliar presence. The outside world remained largely silent. Media attention in the early stages was limited. The case did not immediately capture widespread interest, which influenced the scale of public awareness and search efforts. Without sustained visibility, cases like this can quietly recede, transitioning from active investigation to unresolved file, without ever reaching a point of clarity. Over time, the case settled into what is often referred to as a cold case. This does not mean the investigation ended, but rather that it lost momentum. Leads were exhausted or failed to produce results. The absence of new information became the defining characteristic, reinforcing the sense that whatever happened had left very little behind. Within that stillness, suspicion continued to focus on Michael Viola. As the last known person to see Patricia, his proximity to the event placed him at the center of investigative attention. This is not uncommon. In cases of domestic disappearance, statistical patterns often guide initial assumptions, even in the absence of direct evidence. Potential motives were considered, including the possibility of marital conflict. Relationships, especially those that appear stable externally, can contain layers of tension that are not immediately visible. However, without documented incidents or corroborating testimony, these possibilities remained theoretical rather than actionable. No witnesses emerged to confirm any form of confrontation. No physical evidence connected Michael to an act of violence. The case remained defined by what could not be proven. This creates a unique psychological space where suspicion persists not because of evidence, but because of proximity and probability. At the same time, investigators explored the possibility that Patricia had chosen to leave voluntarily. This required examining her personal history, her behavior, and any indication of dissatisfaction or intent to disappear. Yet nothing in her background strongly supported this theory. There were no clear signs of planning or preparation. The family's private nature complicated this analysis. Limited social interaction meant fewer external perspectives on Patricia's emotional state. Without those perspectives, it becomes difficult to establish whether internal struggles existed or whether her life was as stable as it appeared from the outside. One of the most critical developments in the case was not the discovery of new evidence, but the confirmation of absence over time. Patricia's financial accounts showed no activity. There were no attempts to access money, no records of travel, no communication with friends or relatives. Her presence did not extend beyond the day she disappeared. In missing person investigations, continued activity often suggests survival, even if location remains unknown. The complete lack of such activity in Patricia's case gradually shifted the interpretation. It made the theory of voluntary disappearance increasingly difficult to sustain, not because it was impossible, but because it lacked supporting behavior. This absence of continuation carries strong psychological weight. It points not merely to a disappearance, but to an interruption. A life that did not evolve into another form, but instead stopped producing traceable patterns. That distinction shifts how investigators interpret the case and evaluate remaining possibilities. As each theory was considered and then set aside due to missing evidence, clarity did not increase. Instead, complexity grew. Every unanswered question widened the uncertainty, forming a network of possibilities that could neither be confirmed nor completely dismissed within the limits of available information. Suddenly, the case was no longer as simple as it once seemed. More than 2 decades have passed, and Patricia Viola remains a name suspended in uncertainty. There is no confirmed outcome, no definitive explanation, and no closure that allows the story to settle. Time, which often clarifies events, has instead deepened the ambiguity. The longer the silence persists, the more it reshapes how the case is understood, not as an incident, but as an enduring absence. One of the most discussed explanations is the possibility of domestic conflict. This theory does not emerge from direct evidence, but from probability and proximity. In cases where individuals disappear within their own homes, the statistical likelihood often points inward. The fact that Michael Viola was the last known person to see Patricia naturally positions him within that framework of suspicion. From a behavioral standpoint, the theory carries weight. There were no signs that Patricia intended to leave, no preparations, no indicators of voluntary departure. The absence of forced entry suggests that if something did occur, it may have involved someone within the home. These elements align with patterns seen in other cases involving unresolved domestic tension. However, the theory is constrained by the same limitation that defines the entire case. There is no physical evidence, no forensic confirmation, no witness testimony, no material trace that transforms suspicion into proof. Without that foundation, the theory remains plausible, but unverified. It exists in a space where logic suggests one direction, but evidence refuses to follow. An alternative perspective considers the possibility of voluntary disappearance. In this interpretation, Patricia made a decision to leave her life behind, quietly and without announcement. The lack of visible conflict or disturbance could support this view, suggesting a controlled and deliberate exit rather than an abrupt interruption. Yet this theory encounters its own limitations when examined over time. Voluntary disappearance typically involves preparation, access to resources, and some form of continued existence, even if hidden. In Patricia's case, there is no financial activity, no communication, no trace of adaptation to a new life. The absence is not just immediate, but sustained. When comparing the two theories, the balance tends to shift toward the domestic explanation, not because it is proven, but because it aligns more closely with the available context. The voluntary departure theory requires assumptions about behavior that are not supported by evidence. It asks us to accept a disappearance without continuity, which is statistically less common. Still, neither theory resolves the case. Each contains gaps that cannot be closed with the information available, and that is the central tension of this mystery. It is not a matter of choosing the correct explanation, but of confronting the limitations of what can be known. Which theory do you believe makes the most sense when both are incomplete? From a psychological perspective, cases like this often reveal patterns that extend beyond the individuals involved. In domestic disappearances, the circle of suspicion tends to remain close to the victim. This is not an assumption of guilt, but a reflection of recurring statistical trends observed across similar cases over time. Behavioral analysis also considers the timing of actions. Delays in reporting a disappearance can carry multiple interpretations. They may reflect confusion, denial, or an expectation that the person will return. But they can also indicate hesitation, a moment of internal conflict where the decision to involve authorities is not immediate. It is important to recognize that human behavior under stress is rarely linear. Individuals respond differently to uncertainty, especially when it involves someone close to them. A delay by itself does not confirm intent, but within a broader context, it becomes one element in a larger pattern that investigators must consider carefully. In contrast, the psychological profile of Patricia does not strongly support voluntary disappearance. Individuals who leave intentionally often exhibit signs of preparation, whether emotional, logistical, or financial. In her case, those signs are either absent or not documented, making the theory increasingly difficult to sustain over time. Beyond psychology, there is a philosophical dimension to this case that cannot be ignored. From an Eastern perspective, actions are often viewed through the lens of consequence. Every decision, every moment, creates a chain of outcomes that eventually surface. Even when hidden, truth is not erased, only delayed in its emergence. Silence, in this view, is not emptiness, but concealment. It holds within it the weight of what has not yet been revealed. The absence of answers does not imply the absence of truth. It simply reflects the distance between action and understanding, a distance that time alone does not always resolve. From a Western philosophical perspective, the case speaks to the complexity of human nature. People are capable of presenting stability while experiencing internal conflict. They can maintain routines while concealing deeper tensions. Under certain conditions, behavior can shift in ways that are not easily predicted or understood. This unpredictability is what makes cases like this so resistant to closure. They exist at the intersection of observable behavior and hidden intention. Without access to the latter, interpretation remains incomplete. The mind becomes both the source of action and the barrier to understanding it. As the years pass, the absence of Patricia Viola becomes more than a missing person case. It becomes a space defined by unanswered questions, by possibilities that cannot be confirmed, and by a silence that resists interpretation. The longer it continues, the more it challenges the assumption that every event can be explained. Her family remains without a clear answer, suspended between hope and acceptance. The community, once certain of its quiet stability, carries a subtle awareness that even the most ordinary environments can conceal uncertainty. The case leaves behind not resolution, but a shift in perception. A person can disappear without leaving, a trace even within the place they felt safest. That reality is what makes this case deeply unsettling. It is not defined by what is known, but by what is missing, by the absence that cannot be filled, and by the questions that continue to remain unanswered. Some crimes leave no screams, only questions, and some silences echo louder than any confession. Thank you for listening to Criminal Mindcast.